Welcome, welcome, everyone. Jay Shafer is going to be joining us any moment. Behind the scenes, things are happening. All the technological support, calling in the technological gods and goddesses to make sure everything works. As you roll in this room, let us know where you're coming from. This is the Global Tiny House Conference, and you'll be hearing from Jay Shafer speaking about the dark side of tiny. So interesting. And while I have everyone here, I do want to share before everyone gets on. This is in honor of the book that started the revolution. We'll be sharing about this in a little bit, but this is the Small House book by Jay Shafer. And this is the book that started the revolution. There are many amazing books about tiny home living, but this was Jay's, and that is the link. I'll put it in the chat. So we'll be sharing a little bit more about that in a moment. As soon as Jay gets here, awesome, love it. Hello, everyone out there from Tennessee, Laguna Hills, Arizona, Ontario, Canada, New Jersey, Colorado in the house. Woohoo! Wonderful. And how to view back earlier sessions of today, I am not quite sure, but I do know our dear friends Zach and Jason are tuning in, so they'll be able to give information. Massachusetts, Georgia, Petaluma. Earlier sessions actually will probably be something that will get delivered in a day or two. They have to put all the video together, pull the things together. So expect to see an email. Here comes Jay. Yay, Northern California, Redmond, Oregon, Columbus, Ohio. This is so exciting. Yay, yay. Hi, Jay.
Hello, Lindsay. It's good to see you. I think I'm still not visible, but I'll change that now.
Okay.
Here I am.
It's
good to be here.
You too. Good to see you, Jay.
This technical stuff just drives me nuts.
I know. That's why you build tiny homes, right?
I know. That's pretty much my bailiwick is designing tiny houses. Once I step outside of that, I'm in trouble.
And I did give people a sneak peek of the book, and I know we'll talk about it a little bit later. I love it. The Small House book, the book that started the revolution. So without further ado, everyone, this is Jay Shaver. A lot of us refer to him as the godfather of tiny homes. I'm not sure if he says pioneer. There we go. The pioneer. I like that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I've been called worse. Yeah.
Take it away, Jay, with the dark side of tiny.
All righty. I'm a bit self-conscious about this because I actually wrote an article called The Dark Side of Tiny about a decade ago. It was for a blog post, and I never posted it because I was told it was too dark. Hopefully by now I can just kind of lighten it up a bit, or at least it seems like some facts just should be out there, and if everyone can bear with me. I think that I may have some important things to say. I guess I'll start with my own history. It was alluded to. Back in 1997, I started building my own house. It was too tiny to be legal. When I discovered those laws that prohibited it, I decided I was going to put it on wheels and show those laws a thing or two by saying, look, safe, efficient, affordable housing should not be illegal. And, by 2000, my house had actually been finished. I had moved in. A book I'd been writing during the building process was released at that time. And pretty much immediately I became famous, promoting tiny house stuff, mostly as a form of civil disobedience, which worked really well because it turns out the media loves eye candy and a good human interest story. So, within about 5 years or even just a couple of years, there were a half dozen other folks living in diminutive dwellings of their own. Greg Johnson and Dee Williams come to mind. And we were speaking out against these laws, but we didn't have to do that much speaking because our houses were so cute. They did most of the talking for us, and that was great. And I'd say within the next 3 or 4 years, people were calling what we were doing a movement. I mean, several hundred, if not thousand, people had actually moved into these structures after all. And it was great because we got to say what we wanted to say and do what we wanted to do in terms of changing housing law. And some of those laws got changed, and it's been good. The dark stuff of which I speak doesn't really come in until about 2012. In that year, like in just 1 month of that year, I received over 100 threats of slap suits. Slap suits are, you know, threatened lawsuits that aren't actually about anything. They're just designed to eat up legal costs, like you have to hire a lawyer and all that stuff. And those threats weren't just limited to me. They were also directed at every employee who was working with me at the time. And they were all coming from another company that just wanted to shut a competitor down. It was it was very hair-raising for all of us in the movement at that time because, I guess slap suits are a scary thing. Since then, I have learned to ignore slap suits. By the way, if you ever receive a notice from a lawyer that's saying you were being sued for something ridiculous, you could just write back saying, I do not believe this is true. The end. Which is basically what every government institution writes when they are accused of breaking the law. So, before I get much deeper into this darkness, I should mention something important to me, which is that I don't really feel that the movement has ever become dark or even anything less than bright and shiny. When I speak of these things, I'm really speaking of people who have come in and tried to essentially appropriate the identity of the movement or people within and use that to sell their almost always crappy wares. So the movement itself has fared pretty well. It's amazing it still exists considering what it's been up against. And I should also mention as I go on that I don't want to confuse malice with ignorance. Not everybody who's, made it difficult for the movement is actually out to hurt anybody. Sometimes it's just that we, of course, don't know what we're doing, or we lose track in the bureaucracy of things, especially when it comes to government and big business. And in that bureaucracy, it's easy to lose track, apparently, of everything that's going on. So with that caveat in mind, I will say that things continued to be pretty rocky for a while. There was some guy online posing as Jay Shafer. That wasn't actually me, Jay Shafer. Selling a bunch of crap, tiny house related stuff, selling workshop tickets for a high price, and then telling people when they got to the workshop, well, sorry, he didn't show up. Or D. Williams' name was also used for that. Other big names in the tiny house world were used for that. And, to be honest, part of my intrepidation around mentioning any of this is I don't want it to seem like a piece of like revenge journalism, because a lot of this did affect me personally and friends of mine and employees of mine. I've got bigger fish to fry right now, but it does seem worth mentioning that one should be careful, because around that same time, whether you're involved directly in the industry or not, of tiny houses, a lot of folks, not a lot, but at least a handful I knew of, were selling tiny houses, collecting down payments for tiny houses, and then disappearing. And that became a problem for, as you can imagine, anyone who had purchased a fake tiny house. So, it was around 2012 or so that I started fading out of the movement in terms of leadership, because it was just too rich for my blood. I know a few other big names in the tiny house world didn't want anything to do with it either. I mean, it's just not, when you're answering lawyer letters and all, it's not about designing tiny houses or pushing for housing rights anymore. It's about, well, addressing a lot of fake stuff. So, I stepped out to a degree. I still do interviews, and I love to do this thing, and I love to still communicate with a lot of people in the tiny house world, and occasionally sell houses too, and plants. But it soured me a bit in terms of the stuff one has to do to survive in the tiny house world. it was around that same time, like 2012-ish. Well, this had been going on for a long time, but it was around 2012 that things got interesting with government and big business. Because, well, the movement had started as this outspoken civil disobedience against housing laws that made no sense because they prohibited efficiency and affordability and even safety. And the codes, so in my book, I think I mentioned that I'd been writing a book while building my first house. And by that time I moved in and published images of my house, the book was out, and all the stuff about the bad codes was known, and that was at the core of the movement. We changed a few things, but around 2012 or so, actually a lot of good stuff was going on in terms of that organization that makes those codes. It's a private organization that writes housing legislation for government, mostly state and local governments who pick that up, and that that code then becomes law once it's been picked up by state and local governments. It can be tailored at that level, but usually it remains more or less the same. So what happened around actually it's 2015 is a few good people in the movement created some tiny house provisions, which eventually became Appendix Q of the IRC, International Residential Code. That is the code of which I speak. It's the one that determines the form of most American housing. So those provisions, allow for things like lower ceiling heights, steeper steps or ladders, things that generally are difficult to achieve in a smaller structure when you're abiding by the provisions of the general code. So that was good, but what's happened since then is that the folks who the organization that makes those the code and those creates those provisions has well, they've been caught by Congress. It was discovered in 2019 and revealed through the New York Times that in fact they do have or did have a previously unknown contract with the housing finance industry and some other folks in the world of construction. So, frankly, up until that time, I'd been kind of bluffing in terms of, writing in my book that the problem with the code that was that it was created by industry, and industry likes to sell a lot of stuff, and so it was prescribing inordinately large houses containing a lot of expensive stuff. So that 2019 article got Congress on board. The organization that was creating the code did turn over the contract, but then still maintains one that they refused to turn over to Congress under the claim that it's too proprietary and sensitive. So who knows what's going on there. But this is where just to simplify things, in terms of the problem that remains with the code that the tiny house movement was formed in order to address. The problem remains that even Appendix Q, a part of the code that's for tiny houses to allow for more, basically to allow tiny houses to be built to some extent, still is connected to the rest of the code, which prescribes things like no less than 10 inches of insulation in the roof if you're north of Boca Raton, Florida. A lot of room sizes that have nothing to do with the only real purpose of any law in the United States, which is health, safety, and general welfare, which is mostly efficiency and cost effectiveness. So those 30 plus provisions of the code are problematic. Now, the way to get around those provisions is to read the I never thought I'd be talking about housing law so passionately, but because it all sounds very boring from the outside, but once you start realizing how weird it is, it does get interesting. in the administrative sections of the code, especially right up front in the prelude and introductory chapters, it does say in somewhat small print in a convoluted way that parts of the code that are not for health, safety, and general welfare shall not be enforced. It's difficult for enforcers then to interpret that and then pick out which particular provisions are actually inoperable as law. So right now, virtually at least most code enforcers in the United States are enforcing a lot of code prescriptions that aren't legal as law. And that is why we have too many McMansions, and building tiny houses has been difficult all this time. Now, the good news behind all this is that the tiny house movement is winning. And there's really no way to build or beat it, because the entire movement is based on loopholes in the laws, in the housing laws. And for that matter, it's based on constitutional law, which says that, all laws have to address health, safety, and general welfare. Turns out tiny houses are more about that than the houses that are prescribed by code are. So the big news is I was wrong when I wrote in my book that tiny houses are illegal. They're not illegal. They seem to be illegal when all you're looking at is the housing laws, the codes. But when you look at the laws that actually preempt those laws, the laws that govern how those laws get used, and you read the fine print in the codes themselves, you'll see that as long as a house is as safe, efficient, and cost effective as the standards that are set by the code, it's legal. And it's not hard, it's kind of a low bar, so it's not hard to build a tiny house that meets that standard. A bit of the trick is hoping that your code enforcer in your area can figure out which parts of the code are legitimate and which parts were just written by the housing finance industry and construction materials industry to boost sales. There is a way to tell, and I'd say the easiest way, there are a few ways, and the easiest way to tell is if it's prescribing stuff, especially expensive stuff, that isn't really necessary, then it ain't a law. It ain't an operable law anyway. And if you catch yourself, at any point you want to design a tiny house, you'll run into those laws very quickly. So if you want to figure out what they are, you can wait for my essay to come out where I will list them. Or you can just start designing a tiny house, and you will soon see that, it's really hard to design something that's safe and efficient, and affordable for that matter, if you're abiding by every provision in the code. Now, I want to go back to the fact that a lot of the people in the ICC, I think probably what's happened is that people are just confused as heck about the code. I mean, some of the provisions of the code were adopted from 1919. That's when the first model building code was released and enacted as law. And it was very much designed for industry and government. The government's role in all this, by the way, is, local governments and state governments traditionally have really liked a body of laws that promotes expensive housing, because it keeps the tax base high, and it keeps a lot of the poor people at bay, or at least it's designed to. Unfortunately, when you enforce these laws in every municipality in the country, then it kind of cancels out because nobody moves anywhere because everything's expensive. And that is how darkness infiltrated the tiny house movement, or I should say, how the movement has been preyed upon by parasites trying to take our life's blood, which is really common sense. I'm really glad, actually, Lindsay, I love seeing your face here because I hate talking to a blank screen. I always, am I actually talking to anybody, or did I go offline a while ago?
You are talking to me. We're talking to all of us. You got some really good, comments in here. what is it? One person I love, you said, you know, you're not famous until people try to steal your identity. But I do have a question. So someone just asked, who are the best lawyers in the US who defend tiny house owners? I'm assuming this gets into like legality as to where to place it and which legal cases have set the best legal precedents.
These are really good. Okay, this person is thinking ahead of where I've gotten to, because I don't have a list. I guess I have some bookmarks of like, which contains free sources of legal assistance that are effective, like the Innocence Project, which wouldn't apply here so much because it's not about somebody being in prison so much. But the ACLU is pretty good about is good about maintaining constitutional law, you know, our rights. So it would be a good organization to turn to find, whereby one could find lawyers to address, you know, to actually, I guess, I don't know who would be sued exactly. Sadly, the way it's rigged right now, because the code has fine print saying enforcement shall not include any provision herein that is not constitutional. It seems like that it's put the enforcers in the hot seat, which is to say it may come down, I guess it would come down to suing every enforcer who has acted under color of law in deprivation of rights, which is just to say they've enforced a law that wasn't really enforceable, and that deprives someone in our country of due process. That would be a mess. I don't want to see that. For one thing, I think the enforcers have taken the short end of this stick for long enough. They are put out, they've been hung out to dry. I'd rather see the states, I'd rather see somebody, I'd rather see the states get some common sense. I don't imagine the states have actually read through the entire code. When I look at the whole thing, I'm like, geez, how did this stuff get through? And when I look at this stuff, I'm like, well, it's no wonder, considering how much, you know, you have to read in order to, it's like reading an agreement for like an Apple phone or an iPhone or virtually anything else online these days. It's like, well, I can't say I read all the fine print in those, so I can't blame anybody else. But I think the way out of this may be through the states.
And actually, the state of Colorado did do a full year process. And one of the best things that happened is that we actually had Tracy Manchego Baker from Tiny Building Experts sitting in on the task force. And if she hadn't been on there, there's a lot of things that would have just been barreled over. And she really fought for appropriate, like, hey, don't make me do such a thick insulation or say goodbye to my loft.
Okay, good to hear.
That was a major one.
I'm gonna have to email you later just to like get the details. Like I'll be forgetting this stuff shortly, and then
It's a whole hour session. I was, once again, I'm here to host and facilitate, and Tracy had all the information. We got to ask a lot of questions. It's on my YouTube channel. I'll put that in the chat. That's just the state of Colorado. But the good news is the state of Colorado now has a specific building standard that actually also covers over even zoning laws. And my understanding is that that now can also be a primary residence as a home on wheels. So we are at, and I think Nevada's following suit with requiring all their local jurisdictions to have new zoning laws. I'm not sure if these are the right words by 2024. So
oh yeah,
very active. We also do have on tomorrow at 5 p.m. Pacific, Dan Fitzpatrick and Brad Wiseman will be talking about the International Code Council and the collaboration with THEA to create a committee. So this is not like anything we're going to talk about tomorrow night. It's not set in any kind of stone, because the committee gets together, a group of diverse background people gets together to actually do that. So there may be still an opportunity for people to apply, because they do want, I've applied, they do want a lot of people that apply, so that you can put voice to all the things that Jay's talking about with regards to, you know, making sure silly things that apply to big homes don't apply to small homes.
thank you, because I know you've put a lot of work into that stuff too, Lindsay. Thank you. Yeah, some of our hope does come from you and other people like Zach Giffen and others who have been working with the ICC, the organization that creates the codes, to make something something better, a tiny house basically Appendix AQ expanded upon, I believe, something like, well, provisions for tiny houses. Um, I don't know exactly how, without severing, like making a separation between that appendix and the rest of the code containing all the consumptive provisions. I don't know how it's going to work, but I have more faith in you guys than I would in myself in that committee.
My understanding at a very high level, because I'm also the one that's learning from the others that are, been at this for a lot longer than I have. But to embed tiny home, or, maybe we'll just use the word movable tiny home, might be tiny home and wheels. We don't know what the actual words are going to be actually into the code, but how it gets in there, what specifics are guiding it, the requirements for it, all those things. And one thing that Tracy was so big at in Colorado was making sure that this still gave the DIYers an option, right? It wasn't just that now it had to go to only commercial builders. So
Like
there's a
that.
lot to converse about. Can you share with me a little bit more, Jay, about the world of building standards, what's applied to building codes, which is what we've been talking about. And then
Mhm.
there's the law of the land, right? The zoning laws. Did you
Right.
do much, because that's, I think, where a lot of people get a little confused. There's how the home is built, what standard it's built to, and then the land below your feet.
Right. So initially, zoning laws and building codes were developed somewhat separately, although in tandem, as with the aim of like benefiting government and industry. It was back in like 1919 through the early 1920s. Zoning got shot down really quickly because it was overt. Even their language was just overtly racist. It's like at least the building codes did a pretty good job of masking their bias as more like socio-economic bias, and that was PC back then, so it got through. But these codes of, the zoning is actually subject to the same preemptive constitutional laws as the code is. So it has to address issues of safety, health, and welfare. That is to say, essentially efficiency and affordability. And if there's a provision if there's a zoning ordinance that does not address those or goes beyond addressing those, it's not operable as law. And zoning is actually way more convoluted and, frankly, has been corrupt historically, because it really has been used to keep poor people out and make big business bigger and behoove government without any attention, well, not much attention anyway, to the public and its needs. So luckily, it's a whole new guard now in zoning departments and building departments. And I'm hoping at the ICC too. It seems a little better, perhaps. A lot of the folks going in there are actually tiny house fans. This stuff started 20 years ago. So by now, a lot of the old, not in my backyard people are retiring or getting fired. And a lot of people who are actually into fixing the problems that zoning and building codes caused are going in. So
Here's a little factoid. You'll love this historical. I wondered where R1 came from. If anyone's not familiar, R1 is like called a residential code where you put one single family home on. So way back when, like late 30s, Berkeley, surprise, surprise, there was a group of Black people that wanted to put together a dance hall in the area of Claremont of Berkeley. And the way they got that pushed back was they all of a sudden came up, I'm simplifying things, but they came up with residential one zoning, which we call single family zoning, R1, all those things that we know of actually come from racism practices. So
that's helpful.
100%. Then it came in, then it turned into what we now call zoning, but you'll still see a lot of zoning laws still have rhetoric and verbiage inside there that declare a certain class or certain person of color, all the things. So there's a lot to be done. And the good news is places like Santa Cruz County, Placer County, Mendocino County soon, they've actually said yes to placing a movable tiny home as a primary residence. The state of California and Oregon have said instead of R1 zone, instead of one home, you can put 4 homes on that property. right? Think of your tiny home community that could be 4, maybe even 6. So there's a whole bunch of work we're doing on both the standards and the zoning laws.
That's very good. I'm gonna have to add that to my essay, because yeah, the zoning has been a huge problem. It's, it really shows up, well, when you're trying to build like a house in your backyard, for example, or wheel one back there. Like you said, California is actually getting ahead of it a bit with its, preemptive laws that now say no municipality in the state shall prohibit little houses in backyards because we need to increase density and allow for affordable housing. It's like trying to fix a lot of the problems that now exist. And I think that may be, the states, the states aren't inherently evil. Nobody in industry is inherently evil. I think as people come to understand the root of the problem here, they are turning around. So my hope is for more education. And I'll be putting out this essay. I'll be adding your information to this essay, and I'll be going back and looking at some of these recordings of the global conference for more information.
And I like Deb said, I think many of us would fight this fight if we had experts like you guys at our side. Otherwise, it feels so intimidating. We hear you. And there is a group that's working hard, and that's the Tiny Home Industry Association, which, gosh, I should have my link to all the cities: San Diego, Los Angeles, San Luis Obispo, Fresno, Santa Clara, San Jose, Placer, Santa Cruz County, Humboldt County, Sonoma County, and soon Mendocino County have all said yes to movable tiny homes, either as an accessory dwelling unit or in some cases as a primary residence. So the fact that that's happening, a lot of times people just don't know that's out there. And then we actually have a guidance as to how to take you through talking to your local official, become more informed, using what Jay shared about becoming knowledgeable so that you go in with all the information and the facts to push the envelope. It's the reason why they're in those positions is we put them there. We're taxpayers. We pay for those positions of the people in power. So it's time for us as a community to speak up as advocates for alternative, affordable, attainable, smaller homes, all the things, whatever floats your boat with regards to tiny homes. So yeah.
And villages too.
Villages, yeah, community clusters. I know that word's been used, planned unit development, SB 9 can even be used, not with the wheels, but of course, when you have an SB 9 project in a city that says yes to primary residents being on wheels, I don't even know if they've dealt with an issue like that. So there's new things all the time, all the way. And you going into your local planning department to be the constant guiding light of where you want this to go. It's great. I love this. Tiny houses matter. That's what Deb said. We need this mantra posted everywhere. Yes. Any other questions, everyone, for Jay? This is phenomenal to get Jay's mind and brain and vision. I think there are some, let me look in the back.
Yeah, I really appreciate Lindsay going in and actually reading questions, fielding them, and sorting through, because I cannot speak and read and think all at the same time. So
that's right. City of Port Angeles and Port Townsend recently added code to allow for long-term living in a tiny home and allow adding tiny home to your property for living or Airbnb must be certified. Yes, we spoke earlier today about certifying. So Jay, do you consult one-on-one? Like, what are your services in the world? How can people connect with you? And this might be a good time to share my screen and talk about the book too.
Oh my gosh, thanks for this question. You're always thinking of my betterment. Thanks, Lindsay.
Of course.
Because I would love to do more consultations. I'm good at designing houses, and I know the laws surrounding the houses. So if those are issues for anyone, I can be reached through my email account, which is jshaferdesigns with an S at gmail.com.
Right, there it is. SHAFER.
That's it. Thank you for asking.
Cool.
And yeah, I like selling my book. Hey, a truck's driving by in my house. I'm in my tiny house. Sorry about that noise. They're gone now.
We didn't hear it. The beauty of Zoom, they actually back out background noise. Here's a question from Sam. How has the development been around foundation built tiny homes at or below 400 square feet? Zoning laws are still all over the place.
Yeah, okay. This is oh, thanks for reminding me, sir. ma'am, whoever you were asking the question.
Sam.
Sam, thank you, Sam, because this brings me to a point. I don't know if I had just mentioned this or not. I may have, but I'll mention it again because it deserves mentioning again. Zoning laws, what was I just gonna mention? I just
Well,
went,
well, this is the foundation one. So a
oh,
lot of
right,
this conversations around wheels, but the foundation, oftentimes, if the wheels are not allowed, how do you address that? So
right, right.
at or below
So
400 square feet.
that would be primarily Appendix AQ in the International Building Code or Residential Code, the IRC's Appendix AQ. Like I said, there's a problem because that is still connected to a lot of provisions that aren't operable as law. But if you've got a smart enforcer in your area, then you can just, stick with the laws that count. I think the primary problem I have with Appendix AQ is actually not the appendix itself, but it's conditional use. The code says it's optional, so local governments can choose to either include it in their building code or just ignore it, which makes absolutely zero sense considering anything that has been proven to be as safe as the standard set by the code in general, all those other things, is allowed. So I don't know how a local municipality would go about not allowing for those provisions, but I don't think they would be doing it with operable law. They'd probably be overstepping in that.
And this is important. If you need to use the words, do you provide a variance, conditional use permit? Some of the buzzwords that I've heard in the industry be used, there's nothing really black and white here. And Jay nailed it. It really comes down to the jurisdiction they're in. Are they more, definitely look at your local officials that they talked about, the housing crisis, because they're solving it, whether you're putting something on a backyard or a primary residence on property. If you're building a new unit that you or someone else you can live in, you're creating more housing. So this next question is super important. I want to know about transitioning the tiny home on wheels onto skids or foundation to comply when necessary.
Thank you for that brilliant question. That would apply to me as well because I tend to design pretty much everything I design these days can be taken off a trailer or put on a trailer, set on skids or piers. I actually don't know the answer to the question though, because
I do.
you do. Thank you. Of course you do. Thank you, Lindsay. Take it away.
Okay, so the deal is most of our industry is building tiny homes to the NFPA or ANSI code. If they're on wheels, they're built on a chassis. If they're not built on a chassis, they're built on skids. So a skid can have a forklift come, pick it up, put it up on a trailer, and now the trailer can roll there on wheels. So either way, your home's getting to some property somewhere on wheels. Whether or not it can be taken off the trailer and put on. Now, if you build a home and you attach your framing and everything to the actual chassis, can the wheels come off? Physically, absolutely. Right? We can unweld entire what do you call it? Your axles, your springs, your brakes, your tires, and everything. The reason why I know that is our builder did the wrong axles and tires for our tiny home, and so they had to jack that thing up, unweld all of our undercarriage with all that material, and then they put a new axle system on there. So physically it can be done. But if the home was built to a certain building standard and the jurisdiction does not allow you to live in that type of standard and they're getting that fussy, that's an issue. Or this is the gray area. If you can say, look, my home was built to an RV standard, either NFPA or ANSI, but we're going to fix it to ground just like you'd require any of the other homes to do. Will that work? And we have seen cases like in Fresno County where they did allow it. So they didn't pass any earlier ordinance to say, yes, movable tiny homes are allowed. They literally built one to an RV standard, but the county said yes, because they met all the requirements for how to affix it to the ground. Now, once you fix it to the ground, which requires bolts and all those things, if somewhere down the road you want to unaffix it, which is a big reason why people want to have it movable, then you can. because you just drilled the screw in and now you can undrill the screw and then take it elsewhere. How your rules get into like, you can record it as real property in some cases. So there's no guidebook for this one. This is literally comes down to your jurisdiction and talking with them and using your willpower and your knowledge and your expertise to share with them the light of you creating more housing, which is probably their biggest issue, is how to create more housing. So did that help?
Help me. Thank you. I also should mention that I've always been a big fan of, loopholes. It's how the whole tiny house movement started. And I've always just like attached my houses to the trailer in an impermanent way that can be easily undone, because codes and zoning have a very hard time with that, because it becomes a matter of like interstate transit and they don't want to deal with that. And that would remain a loophole even when they're saying it has to be certified as an RV. The thing, it gets pretty fuzzy, and the fuzziness is what wins the game. It's also what can frustrate municipalities, because they don't really have any laws necessarily saying you can't live in a load on a flatbed trailer. But once again, zoning is required to allow for anything that's as safe as its prescriptions. So there you go. It's all like just talking to the locals and saying and educating them, preferably nicely, because they like
Yeah.
that.
Nice will go a long way, and do some research. I'll give you the quickest research tip right now. Go onto your city or county website, wherever you live and where you're wanting to go forward and be vocal and visible and all those things. For all of you that want to go under the radar, this does not apply. For those of you that want to do it, with permits and all that in the eyes of the law, go find the people that are passionate about housing. Homelessness, if they're running on a platform that is speaking to homelessness, well, tiny homes are a part of that. Maybe people aren't necessarily homeless that are moving into these, but there's a massive issue of just lack of affordable, because we haven't been building homes since the 70s like we did in the 40s, 50s, 60s. So we're having a crunch of economics.
Yeah.
I did see a really good question though, Jay, and I think it would be really good. SK asks, does Jay consider all of the entrepreneurs making tiny houses and tiny parking unaffordable part of the dark side?
Well, I'm glad that was asked, because that would be a big no. I'm sure that the questioner probably just gave that to me so I could say no. I mean, yeah, there are some, but most are good. In
Oh, this
fact,
is good. Craig says, I have been told by my town zoning officer that I will be fine as long as the home is permanently attached to a foundation. Well, permanently, okay. Drill a giant drill into the hole, and that is what they call permanent. Think manufactured homes roll in on wheels and they get placed up on metal piers. That is what they considered a permanent foundation. Okay. We just often think concrete and all this other stuff. And then as I'm a few weeks from actually submitting an application to develop vacant lands, we will see. So awesome, Craig. Craig gets the big bonus points for the day for going down the rabbit hole and going in to talk with them. Because that's not easy. That starting point is your action, right? There's the dream, which is a fantasy if there's no action applied. But if you take action, in this case, this is great.
Wow, Lindsay, you've come a long way. I mean, you started like with the biodiesel stuff when I met you, and now like you've learned a lot about this housing stuff.
Well, I do have a question for you. So when we met, it was like 2003. You were living in Iowa, but I think it would be really cool to hear again, like, sitting around a campfire. Here we are with, Jay Shafer, the visionary, pioneer of the tiny house movement. What made you do it? Like, where were you? Not everyone here. Has anyone heard this story of Iowa, the RV? Say no if you haven't heard it. If you want to hear it, let us know in the chat. Who wants to hear it? No, I haven't. Who wants to hear? Just put yes. Okay, I want to hear it. I want to hear it. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, tell us, Jay.
Well, it all started back in well, I think I moved into my Airstream trailer, which is only 14 feet long, back in 97, and immediately started designing a house of about that same size that I could build and live in. And that's around the time when I ran across the prohibitions on small houses too. And that's when I said, oh, well, if it's illegal, I got to do it, because somebody has to show that this is dumb. And yeah, and then I lived in my Airstream trailer for like 3 years before I moved into my house. And when I did move into my house, I went to the local zoning department and said, can I live in this? And they said, well, not really. Let's just call it camping out in your own backyard. Because I'd bought a 300 square foot derelict house, rented it to a friend, and then I proceeded to camp out for 5 years in my own backyard. It went very well. Decided to move to California because I heard this woman, Lindsay Wood, then Hassett, was living in Sonoma County, as was Trayton Heckman, another cool guy. So I figured, oh, well, I guess all the cool, sustainable people are living in Sonoma County, so I'm going to too. And this is where I've been living ever since. And I first met Lindsay at another event where you were speaking and I was speaking. It was actually in Iowa. I met Trayton in Denver, or in Colorado anyway, at an event where we were both speaking on separate topics. So that is the brief history of how I got.
One piece I like to share, and what's so telling of why we are where we are in this industry, is that you lived in an RV, an Airstream. How thick were those walls?
Oh, this is a good point. Those walls were only 2 inches thick, and the
And
insulation sucked.
where for 5 years? So I'm sorry, you were in Iowa. What happens in Iowa in winter? How cold does it get?
Sometimes it gets down to like 80 below with wind chill. That's very rare. More commonly, you get down to like 20 below without wind chill.
And so what was going on with your heater inside? Was it keeping up or not doing so great?
Well, it was doing fine. I just didn't understand condensation issues at that point very well. So it's like, I should have opened my vent. It was a catalytic heater which spits propane exhaust into the house, which is to say I was basically being poisoned for 3 years in the winters. That's why I guess I had the headaches. I thought it was just from drinking, but anyway, got me to stop drinking. So I guess that's good. And if I just opened that vent and put on the fan, I would have been much better off in terms of all the condensation and ice forming on the interior walls. But I didn't know. All I know is you got to get the walls up above the dew point, which is a certain temperature on the interior in order to avoid condensation. And even like the Apollo 11 spacecraft only had walls of about 6 inches thick, which means it had an R value of about 14, which, sometimes it was getting down to like 1700. No, that was 1700 above zero. That's how hot it would get in the sun. And I think it was 200 degrees below zero or something like that, Fahrenheit in the shade. So, and the code is requiring like 40 or sometimes 60 R's in a roof. It's ridiculous. And
yes, that's one of the big issues Tracy was dealing with, is how to say, hey, you're requiring this for 3,000 square foot home. We're building a 400 square foot home or less. Can we wiggle here? And they were able to do that because we have people that, push the envelope.
Yeah, I like the idea of just saying, sometimes the code has exceptions, and there are some exceptions in its energy efficiency chapter. I think one of those should be any house that emits less than whatever BTU or consumes less than whatever BTU of propane and emits this much in terms of emissions is exempt from these codes, because tiny houses are like so efficient and they're being prohibited, or at least ostensibly so, by provisions that make them look illegal. So it'd just be nice if the code was like clear. We strive for efficiency, so let's allow for efficiency. What's so conspicuous is that the code says it's about efficiency and safety and all this stuff, and yet it does everything except for allow for it.
It's so true. We are creating an opportunity for, I feel like it's meeting the housing crisis and also solving the climate crisis, because housing accounts for a lot of our emissions on the planet. So, to be able to like meet both of those situations and also just the financial crisis, the amount of energy costs that are going up. Right.
Yeah.
So you've just reduced it by thickening your wall, no more 2-inch RV wall. And you've got at least a minimum 4. Sometimes, they're bigger. It depends on how much space you have width-wise with the tiny home.
Mhm.
And you also create that better insulative quality. So whether you're in Arizona or in the deep cold of the northern parts of this country or around the world, you're more covered and your reduction of energy use is met.
Yes, it's all about, in the end, it's all about efficiency when it comes to sustainability is really just about using less for greater gain, which is efficiency. And tiny houses, you might as well just call tiny houses efficient houses because that's what they are. They're just designed to be efficient, just as much utility or nearly as much or more sometimes in exchange for less investment in terms of
I have
material.
a really good question for you because I know you talked about this. Dual pane versus triple pane. What's your recommendation?
Okay, so my sources may or may not be correct, but this is what I would Google if I were concerned about it. I've been told that the extra pane of glass in a triple paned window doesn't do anything, which I actually believe, considering what I know of insulation, which is really insulation is just dead airspace. So when you pay for a piece of insulation, you're not paying for the fiberglass or the polyester, you're paying for the airspace that it traps. So with the right amount of argon gas or whatever, between two panes of glass, you're going to get good R value. I don't think, I may be wrong, but I don't think that the third pane would do all that much good. It might kill the airspace a bit, but I don't think it'd do much.
Well, and I've also heard that R gas can just also give up it's not effective anymore. And so now you really have a dual pane. So
Oh, there you go.
it'd be interesting to talk to a triple pane person, but these are all things that obviously would be more expensive to install. So some people really want to, better understand their, they're purchasing what you're recommending, either you installing as a DIYer or buying from a builder. That all comes back to the bottom line, what you're paying for.
Yeah. In the old days, we just used storm windows, well, I don't know if you know, but I do know I lived in Iowa. And throughout most of the United States, storm windows have been used, and that's just basically a double pane window. And you take off the second pane in the summer.
Deb mentions, as someone with environmental illness, including EMF sensitivity, I need to live at least 2 miles from a cell tower. How can I do that affordably and safely unless I have a tiny home on wheels? I need to be able to leave if a cell tower gets installed. That is a really good application, Deb. Absolutely. How many of your do you already own land? If you already own land, put like family members, you name it, or are you looking for land? Like LL in the chat. If you own land, you're wanting to put something there, or if you're wanting to live in a community, put in C. Just curious to know who's out there looking for what, because it's so interesting. All right, we got some looking for land, community, they own and they're looking. Yeah.
Every time I talk about my dream for a village, it's like, seems like everybody I know wants the same village. Common house, bunch of private houses, small ones.
I'd be
Maybe.
totally remiss if I didn't bring this up, which is what we talked about. So tell us a little bit more about this, Jay.
That is the book that started a revolution. That's the book I wrote I started writing in 1997 and then released in 2000. And at first it was stapled together because that's all I could afford to do. Since then I've I did a little bit of a few tweaks, and it's actually bound in. It's nice. It's got a lot of pretty pictures and words. And it talks about the housing law in a very cursory way. I was saying tiny houses were illegal then. Turns out I was wrong. So skip that part and go straight to, they seem illegal when you're looking at the codes, but they're not.
And this one comes signed. I know there's, you have the only books in print in this moment, and they're not going to reprint. And so I think you saw it on Amazon for like $80, but if anyone bought it, they're not going to get it because you have all of them.
Yeah, it's true. They're under a tarp behind my tiny house. So yes, if you want a tiny house book, the small house book, please contact me through Lindsay and send Lindsay
And just
money.
include your shipping address, email, phone in the notes section. I tried to do my best. The PayPal's made it a little more challenging than it was a couple years ago. So I just gave my link to do that, and we'll take care of you getting that book. And then it is a signed copy.
Yes, it is.
It is directly from you. So literally it's from Jay's pile behind his house to me into an envelope to you. That's exactly where this money goes. And Jay gets 99% of that money. I'll take a little bit for shipping and all that. So we're excited.
Thank you.
Oh, an audio version. Ooh, Jay, maybe there's a project ahead.
I have thought of that, but
That's
when I
what,
look at the tarp with the books underneath, I'm like, do I really want to do more? But
well,
yes,
one
that
of
would
the funny things though, it's a very visual book, a lot of pictures. So that part could not be portrayed, probably audio version. Um,
would
Perfect. I
be
would
fun.
love Jay to handwrite the word appeared on that sentence about tiny houses being illegal. Yeah.
I
Yes, buy
actually
a copy. You can buy a copy and it'll probably come within about a week or two because I got to get it from Jay and so on. So we just love doing that to support Jay for all the work he's done as the visionary. Big kudos to Jay. And we are at the top of the hour. I'm not sure exactly what's coming next. I think it's the happy hour time.
Yay.
Is that right? Zach, Jason, what's coming up next? Oh, Nick Mosley's coming up next. Awesome. Nick from
Oh,
California Tiny House. Thank you, Jay, for being awesome superstar, visionary, pioneering of the tiny house movement.
thank you, Lindsay. I could not do this without you. And I thank everyone who's come. I love you all. Mwah.
Mwah. Thank you so much. Here's the link for the book. Bless you all.
Blessings.